In the Fallout games, there are hundreds of ways to play the game, with most cases involving you committing violence against whatever poor soul that decides to enter your path. However, we, and by we I mean me, will decide to choose the path of peace and find out, can you beat Fallout 4 without killing anyone? For the rules of this challenge, they are quite simple. I'm not allowed to kill anyone for any reason. But what technically counts as killing? Well, thankfully the Pip-Boy is able to keep track of that, and I will periodically check it to make sure I haven't killed any humans, animals, or creature. And when I do, I simply load to the nearest checkpoint. With an ironic name like Past Life Fizz for a run like this, it was time for my special stats. I put 3 into Perception so I could get the lockpicking perk, 7 into Endurance to avoid being built like drywall, 10 into Charisma because you best believe I'm going to talk my way out of every confrontation if possible, and 5 into Luck for the Idiot Savant. Arriving at the vault just before my subscription to Live could expire, I made sure to set up the auto pay before my Cryon app. Unfortunately, however, my wife forgot to do the same and they inevitably canceled her subscription. I locked away the red roaches in the vault, hid till it was safe, and acquired the Pip-Boy. I then immediately began scrapping every bit of wood I could find, as well as did the duplication glitch to begin farming XP to level up. By the time I was done, I was level 21 before even leaving Sanctuary. I get to see an alien saucer crash land, then gather up some easy caps at Trudy's Diner, and immediately booked to Diamond City, as well as grabbed the antifreeze at Great Garden for a reason I'll explain later. The reason it was important to head to Diamond City was to acquire the Syringer, the key tool to make this run possible, thanks to the Berserker and Pack Syringe. Berserker is to send enemies to frenzy, and Pack to pacify enemies. Gathering the necessary resources for the Pack Syringes are quite simple, because they are pretty easy to find around the Commonwealth, which is helpful because they are much higher on demand. For the Berserker Syringes, that's a bit harder, due to one of the key ingredients being antifreeze. You can find them being sold by merchants, but those are very rare occasions, and I don't think I had the luxury of them selling it even once on this playthrough. However, you can find them scattered around the Commonwealth, but most, if not all, are surrounded by high-level threats that aren't likely to just hand it to me if I ask them nicely. There are places, though, that are less dangerous than others, and if I wanted to try and make any progress through certain quests in the main story, I need to acquire a decent amount of them. I traveled to Jamaica Plains to acquire the antifreeze for the Berserker Syringe. However, the ghouls proved to be that very difficult in my first attempt, so I decided to take a detour to Red Rocket and Quincy, which was far easier since nothing is guarding them. I attempted Jamaica Plains once more, but this time I used my high sneak skills to avoid any problems. Now with the resources needed, I headed back to Diamond City to craft the syringes needed to continue. I spoke to Ellie since I was already there, led a group of wild dogs to one of the Diamond City guards for some easy armor. Then it was finally time to begin the main quest. Clearing the museum without adding a kill to your name requires patience, high pain tolerance, and a little bit of luck. I used a Syringer to send a couple of raiders into a frenzy and pretty much trick the raiders into doing most of the work for me. However, it becomes a little more complicated due to a very common bug where Preston decides to no longer shoot the enemies, forcing me to reload a checkpoint numerous times. If that wasn't bad enough, I also discovered a bug where Preston is unable to do damage to the enemies at all. Eventually, at some point, someone got tired of waiting on Preston to kill them and finish the job themselves, finally allowing me to speak to Preston and summon the Deathclaw to dispose of the raiders. But to my surprise, they were actually able to take out the Deathclaw this time, because of course they would, when I'm not allowed to kill them. I spent the rest of the daylight watching Preston struggle to hit his shots, before speaking to Preston once more, and began following the Minutemen quest. I traveled to 10 Pines Bluff to deal with some raiders, and by that, I mean sprint past all the small fry and immediately shot Jared with the Berserker Syringe, allowing the turrets and nearby raiders to take care of him. Returning to the settlers, then reporting back to Preston, the pest exterminator, he then tells me to clear out the starlit drive of its mall rat infestation. I tried using a nearby dog, but unfortunately he is easily overpowered by the number of mall rats. I don't know why, but I for whatever reason thought it'd be a good idea to use a nearby bottle cap mine, and it technically worked. The problem was, it took me with them. Using the dog strategy once more, he did a little bit better this time, and I used a blood bug to finish the job. Then after building the radio beacon and reporting to Preston, I traveled to Overland Station to deal with some more raiders, but before that I went to Diamond City to craft some more syringes. Inside their nearby hideout, I thought it would have been a simple process, however things became infinitely more complicated once I realized that higher level enemies are completely immune to the Berserker Syringe. So if I'm unfortunate enough, I could find myself unable to complete a quest, forced me to think of another strategy, and it took many attempts before I could finally think of something that seemed to finally have a potential of working. On my successful attempt, I used my intimidation perk on all the raiders I could, and the Berserker on the lower level raiders to distract the nearby turret. Once I lured Clutch into the opening, I used intimidation perk against her, and used a Berserker Syringe against the lower level raider upstairs, then made sure she focused the turret before dealing with the others, because due to me using the intimidation perk, as long as I am not the one dealing damage against them, as well as not holster my weapon, they will remain passive, allowing the raider under this frenzy effect to deal free damage. I pretty much sat back and watched her just hacking and whacking and smacking till she finally dealt with clutch, allowing me to complete the quest, and then I made my way to Preston, and a Brahmin made permanent refuge on my roof. Now that I completed enough Minutemen quests, it was time to storm the castle. Like usual, I sat back, avoided aggro, and allowed the Minutemen to give the Monarch Queen her eviction notice. With that finally taken care of, it was time to continue the main quest and head to the subway tunnels to rescue Nick. There are plenty of triggermen in the subway tunnels, but I use the intimidation perk to pacify enough triggermen to get a cheeky save. Arriving at the vault door, I use the pacifying syringes, giving me the chance to open the door without swiftly being turned into Swift cheese. While traveling inside the vault, this is where things get tricky. I need to enter the next room without anyone following me through, because if they do, then they make it nearly impossible to progress. But to do that, I need to fall deep enough to caution so they don't follow me through, and eventually get into the next room safely. I make sure to save for this next hurdle. For those of you that don't know, while you and Nick make your way to the surface, anyone that Nick kills, the game involuntarily adds that to your kill count. However, saving on as much pack syringes as I did till this point, I made a little more than enough to pacify the enemies in our path, giving Nick no reason to kill anyone. I made sure to stay hidden so the triggerman wouldn't follow me through, and finally approached Skinny and his crew. I convinced them into letting us go with no violence and rescued Nick with no kills added to my name. I returned to Diamond City to tell Nick of Vault 111. Being decently high level, I could picklock my way to Kellogg's house and locate his secret stash, then use Dogmeat to track his scent. I had Nick follow me on the way to Fort Hagen, and I'll explain why a bit later. Making it to Fort Hagen without Nick killing anyone was quite simple. I made sure I ran a safe path and picked up key clues to teleport Dogmeat to sniff them and eventually make it to Fort Hagen with no issues. Once inside, I activate the Securitron on the first floor that does an incredible job of taking care of the synths and turrets on the first floor. And now, it's time to tell you why it was important to bring Nick with me. If you dismiss your companion and draw nearby enemies to their attention, they will take out all the nearby hostiles without ever adding them to your kill count. On the way to Kellogg, I made sure to grab the fat man and the mini nuke, and Nick wasted no time using his new toy against Kellogg and his synths. With Kellogg gone, the Brotherhood had their grand entrance, which of course means more chaos in the Commonwealth. And after the talk with Nick and Piper at Diamond City, me and Nick traveled to Goodneighbor, then shared the memories of this dead bald guy. Knowing the whereabouts of an Institute scientist in the glowing sea, I entered his cave uninvited to then only immediately turn around and travel all the way back to Sanctuary so I can talk to Mama Murphy and acquire the reset code for the Courser, which will be very important in the Green Tech Genetics. Speaking of which, arriving inside Green Tech Genetics, I used Jet and Medics to sprint through the gunners. However, on my first attempt, the gunners figured out it was impossible for me to run through them if they take away my leg privileges. Next attempt, his aim was way off and gave me the opening needed to run past him. Then with one last sprint to the elevator, I spoke with the Courser and initiated the reset code. And doing so allows you to take down the Courser without adding it to your kill count. I reported back to Dr. Amari, then crafted some more pack syringes before heading to the Old North Church. Using some stealth boys I collected from the Courser, I snuck past majority of the ghouls and made it into the railroad hideout without raising any suspicion, and was rewarded with a friendly flashbang. I used him to crack the Courser chip, and on my way to report back to Virgil, I succumbed to the endless abuse of the glowing sea. Reaching Virgil with the Courser chip and reporting my findings to Preston with the gods smiting us with radiation in the sky, I equipped Preston with the spray and pray, allowing him to delete opposing foes. On my way to Sanctuary, I decided to knock out a couple of Minutemen quests, with the first being Sunshine's Tidings. Using the handyman, it proved to not be enough for the ghouls, and trying to lure them to some nearby mirelurks, it was just my luck for an egg to hatch, or as a melee to aggro the mirelurks underground, adding a kill to my stats. With the kill added to my stats, I had no choice but to load a save. Heading back to Sunshine's Hiding, and this time was lucky with some super mutants showing up to do the heavy work for me. Arriving at the next settlement, and theirs was as easy as using a stealth boy to sneak around and grabbing the locket before ever being noticed. Finally traveling to Sanctuary after acquiring the locket, Sturgis gives the blueprint for the teleporter, but I was unfortunately missing the bioscanner. I traveled to Trudy, but was shocked to find her dead, as well as her son sleeping while standing up, so I instead traveled to Diamond City, returned the locket to Blake, and then got the teleport working. I think. In the Institute, I made sure to be as difficult as possible and eventually was removed. Next, I traveled to Country Crossing to save a kidnapped settler, and mastering the art of standing completely still, I become invisible to the naked eye. Using a berserker syringe to distract the raiders, it gives you enough time to mosey on by and unlock the door, then free the settler. Reporting back and discovering a settler burying himself in sand, I was sent to a cabin to clear of his blood bugs. My original plan was to leave them to Covenant and have the turrets deal with them, but the gunners nearby taking them out works too. I cleaned the cabin, then made haste back to Sanctuary to turn in the network tape to Sturgis. Traveling back to Nordhagen, then reporting to Preston to do even more quests. Next up was Grey Garden, and traveling to the water treatment plant, shutting down the turrets, and speeding my way past all the Mirelurks to drain the water and reset the main pump. I expertly maneuvered around my pursuers and returned to Grey Garden. Moving on to the next, I needed to clear out the Breakheart banks of the super mutants, which proved to be very difficult due to most of the super mutants being completely immune to the Berserker syringe. However, there was a nearby Assaultron and Mr. Gutsy, but if I wasn't careful, I could find myself getting caught in the crossfire of an Assaultron's rage. During one of my attempts, it was one of God's greatest jokes to have my kneecaps taken out with a nudge of a nearby car. After countless of failed attempts and loading a save, I found the best strategy was to lead the super mutants to them and have them taken care of little by little, as well as helping them out here and there by pacifying them. The Assaultron was capable of taking out all but one of the super mutants, which was unfortunately the only one that mattered. Using some nearby Mirelurks, I constantly pacified the super mutant, allowing me to push him into the Mirelurk, and I used an excessive amount of syringes and my remaining sanity to continue pacifying him and nudging him ever so slowly towards the Mirelurk, and remain him there until eventually the deed was finally done. Swimming most of the way back to the castle, you'd be crazy to think for even a moment that Preston wouldn't know yet of another settlement that needs my help. However, this time I was stuck between a rock and a hard place, cause all the raiders needed to die, but all were immune to the Berserker syringe, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't use the intimidation perk against all of them, and the only raider that Berserker syringe did work on was immediately removed with one shot to the dome. I had no choice but to summon Preston's aid, dismissing him, and thanks to the legendary weapon I gave him, he cleared out Hangman's Alley with no problem. Traveling to Finch Farm next, I offered to help acquire the family heirloom, sprinting past the foragers and meeting up with the leader. I tried to push him to the bowl of molten metal, because doing so wouldn't add a kill to your stats, but with arms made of noodles, he didn't even budge a bit. So after kindly luring some dogs to help fetch me a melee weapon, and after a couple uses of chems, I briefly became the next Quicksilver. Once I knocked him to the molten metal, it was only a matter of time before the flames finally cooked him well overdone. Finally grabbing the family heirloom and eavesdropping into some family drama, I finally reported back to Preston once again. While making my way to the next settlement, I get a throwaway seat of a Mirelurk Queen attacking a raider outpost. Then it was time to aid another settlement with a super mutant problem. I used a terminal near the front door to summon an army of Projectron Guardians. I lured them towards the Projectron to try to converse with the super mutants. At one point, there was a super mutant hound that I can only assume was going through some things. On the way back to report to the settlement, I ran into some Brotherhood soldiers fighting a Deathclaw. Then an Enclave ambush happened to also occur at the same time with the Deathclaw defeating all of them as well, before even more Brotherhood soldiers showed up to finish the job. I claimed yet another settlement and returned to Preston, seeing my suffering with helping endless settlements continue forth. Next was a settlement near the edge of the glowing sea. However, they were having good problems inside a nearby school, and I already knew that nothing possibly affected by the Berserker syringe is going to be able to take out the goal needed to continue. So I brought a burden along with me to do it for me. Unfortunately, I was caught by surprise by a sleeping ghoul and unable to dismiss Preston in time, and ended up adding a kill into my stats and unfortunately had to load a last checkpoint. So with no choice but to have Preston shoot up the school once more. Am I really going to add that going to the video for the sake of dark humor content?
Of course I am!
Once Preston finally took care of the primary target, I reported back to the settlement and then tended to a kidnapping once again, but this time at Nordhagen Beach. After doing some questionable parkour, I was able to free the settler and taking only minimal damage. With those quests quickly taken care of, I tried to report back to Preston, but for whatever reason, he decided to lock himself in the Minutemen armory. So with no choice but to speak with Ronnie Shaw, and then have her nearly blow me to Kingdom Come with some landmines, I pretty much sat back as she took a million years to dispose of Sarge. And of course, as soon as I entered the armory, Preston magically reappears outside. I decided to make the most of the situation and place the turrets inside the armory to help defend the castle against the Institute in the near future, as well as some artillery so I can go ahead and finish the quest, allowing me to finally continue further into the main quest. During the entire battle of the castle, I sat inside the armory and occasionally repaired the laser turrets when they were destroyed, till I eventually ran out of materials and let the Minutemen deal with the rest, which took a miserable amount of time. But once the castle was successfully defended, I met up with Preston, who told me to meet up with Sturgis, who then sends me on a wild goose chase to find the secret entrance into the Institute. Inside the tunnels, I pretty much sprinted past the enemies till I finally entered the Institute. From there, I was able to teleport the Minutemen inside. During the infiltration to the reactor, I sprinted past the first section and stayed behind Preston and the other Minutemen as they cleared the main hall. Convinced Sean to hand over the code to shut down majority sense, and while Preston was dealing with the remaining enemies, I placed the fusion charge on the reactor, pressed the big red button to destroy the Institute, finally beating the game without killing anyone. That'll do it for this challenge video. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. If you guys have any ideas for a challenge in the future, leave them in the comments, and I hope to see you all in the next video.